Hello and welcome to the fifth and final session on the big issue. This particular session is on industry, and as always with industry we'll be talking about some of the economic contexts in which the magazine exists. But to simplify, really what we're looking at is two things, starting with a conversation and a discussion over the future of magazine industry as a whole and the alternatives that might be available, and that will feed into a larger and wider conversation about the big issue and its industrial contexts, and of course we'll be applying some of the theoretical framework to this. First of all, discussion of the industry as a whole. There are a number of different articles printed and published that discuss the future of the magazine industry. It is quite a contentious issue. It's one that lurches from one side of the argument to another, and some of the key questions we might ask are: why are magazines in decline? Why is it that a younger demographic aren't seemingly picking magazines up anymore? Can magazines increase revenue across different other platforms? Is print still appealing to some advertisers? And so on and so forth. There's a couple of articles that accompany this about the future of magazines and the industry itself. And we'll also start by listening to a short extract from the media show where the future of mainstream glossy magazines is discussed.
Now, the glossies, those high-end fashion and lifestyle magazines, are having a moment. 100-year-old Vogue and Design Bible Wallpaper have produced their biggest ever issues this year, while Cosmopolitan has almost quadrupled its sales figures with a clever marketing strategy. But while some titles are blossoming, it isn't all rosy in the fashion mag garden. InStyle's last print edition is on the newsstands right now, and many weekly titles are in sharp decline. So how are some luxury brands of the magazine world defying the reader and advertising exodus that's draining other areas of print journalism? Well, joining me to discuss this is Faraz Storr, who's editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan, and Chris Sutcliffe, who's analyst at the Media Briefing. Welcome, both of you. Chris, online we've got more gossip, fashion and showbiz than anyone could ever consume every day, even if they wanted to. And the weekly magazines that offered the same kind of thing are struggling. But if we look at these luxury monthly titles like Good Housekeeping, Elle, Esquire for Men, their year-on-year sales are actually rising. Are we seeing a bit of a backlash against all that online stuff that we can get so easily?
Well, as you said, it's very easy for these online brands to sort of replicate the content of the weeklies because, there's nothing, it's kind of generic content in that way. It's why newspapers are having such a hard time transitioning to digital, because that content exists there already. So if there is an area of print that you want to be in, it is this kind of luxury market, because you have a sort of relationship. It's kind of one of those horrible buzzwords, is trust. That a lot of publishers like to say they have with their audience, but it's really just a proxy for, we ask them to pay for things and they pay for them. So these luxury brands really have that sort of advantage there, in that they can still leverage that trust with audiences. It's not something that those weeklies share, which is why I think, as you said, the luxury brands are slightly more resilient.
Well, that's quite good news for you, Farah, because that's actually that's the business that you're in, that luxury end. But interestingly, at Cosmopolitan, you've seen this huge jump in sales. It's quadrupled, but you did take a very risky strategy, one might suggest, to get there, because for a luxury brand, you actually slashed your price. Can you tell us exactly what you did and why?
Yeah, of course. So we are now £1. So some would argue, it's a slash price point. Look, the honest truth is, Cosmopolitan is kind of very unique in that we have the eyes and earballs of the earballs, even we have the eyes and ears of millennials. Mm-hmm. And so millennials, obviously, we know that they get content for free, and actually they get fairly good content for free now. So actually I think it's quite a good price point for us. What I have to do and what my team do is however, because you're a pound, what we are serving inside the magazine actually has to really book expectations. So interestingly, where I think a lot of magazines have failed actually is that they've looked at digital and they have mirrored what digital is doing. So they've gone smaller, more chunk-sized copy. What Cosmopolitan has done is we've engaged more people because of the attractive price point, but we've gone back to our roots with long-form journalism. I'm talking 2,000, 3,000 word pieces. And this is what I think journalists and magazines in particular do best, and that's how you retain readers.
But a big glossy magazine for £1, the only way that would work, I imagine, just on simple economics, is if you're making plenty of ad revenue because you're increasing sales. So it's the ad revenue that's driving this, right? And that's how you can afford to sell it for £1.
So, of course, ad revenue is incredibly important, but actually the interesting thing about Cosmo is it's the ecosystem. So actually, when we changed the price structure, what we also did is we launched on new platforms. So Snapchat Discover, for example, we have almost 1 million women a day there. So you're getting ad revenue from different platforms.
But most of your revenue still comes from print,
it still
right?
comes from
because
print.
you're
Print
not getting much yet from Snapchat, are you?
Look, it's a private company, I can't tell you, but we are doing well. But yes, magazines still make money, Cosmopolitan still makes money. The other interesting thing, though, is that we are looking and expanding hugely our event sides. The live experience of Cosmopolitan, revenue is increasingly going to come from there as well.
And events is important, isn't it? Chris, there's been a huge amount of hype around Vogue this year. It's 100th anniversary. We saw the Duchess of Cambridge on the cover. There was a lot of advertising revenue came from that. I have Vogue's Christmas edition there. It's December edition. And it's a beautiful thing. It's not something that can be replicated online. It creates an expectation. It's like opening a present. Does it really have to look very different in order for it to work?
A lot of the premium publishers now, they like to talk about this lean back experience, this idea that you cannot replicate the sort of experience of leaning back with the print magazine and sort of really experiencing it. So, in that way, they really have to, we feel like the premium publishers really have to sort of double down on that. What's interesting is that because the premium publishers have this relationship with advertisers who are slightly more high-end, a lot of those advertisers are sort of loath to go into the digital advertising ecosystem because it's slightly more unsafe. There are things like ad blocking. There's a lot of ad fraud going out there. So a lot of these premium brands still like the experience of existing in these premium publications that have that sort of lean back experience where people really engage with it more.
Just flicking through the magazine, there is a huge amount of advertising in it. Often it's very beautiful and it's very creative, lovely artwork, but it's page after page of advertising. And in the digital space, we talk all the time about ad blocking. It's really annoying when those ads pop up. Do we accept it in a different way when we flick through a glossy monthly magazine? Because there is so much advertising in these magazines.
No, absolutely. I mean, it was earlier this year, as you said, that Vogue had its sort of biggest issue ever. It sort of had more advertising per page than it's ever had before. I think people are a lot more accepting of advertising in print just because they're habituated to it in a way that in the sort of digital ecosystem, what with the rise of ad blocking, what with just good UX kind of relies upon you not having too many ads there. So yeah, people are a lot more accepting of advertising within publications, and Vogue charges something like $36,000 for a full page ad that they can choose where it goes in the magazine. So they really do have the ability to sort of control that price point.
Farah, you talked about your online presence, Instagram and Snapchat Discover, but also you've obviously got your website as well,
Yes.
and you work very closely, I know, with your editorial team on your website.
Yep.
But how do you make sure that you're pushing people not just to get the information off the website, which they get for free, but to actually persuade them to buy your magazine, which you need them to do so that you can, A, get that £1 and also get the ad revenue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, when I joined Cosmopolitan, I was very clear about one thing, which is it's not digital or print, it's digital and print, and actually there are great opportunities for both. One thing that we do, which I think a lot of people haven't done, is the content that you get on Cosmopolitan online is very different to the content that you get in the magazine. I think we would be crazy to replicate it. Why would you? You'd go and get it for free. So that's why with the magazine we've gone back to very long form features, different content, a lot of first person reportage. We don't do that on the website. There is a crossover in audience, but also we have different consumers for different platforms as well.
Look, Chris, looking at some of the other magazines that aren't doing so well,
which is most of them,
really. Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few that I've actually listed that are succeeding, but we've got competitors that are falling away. Some listeners will remember Company magazine, that's gone. It's InStyle's last issue. Reveal has gone. There's a whole list of other weeklies that are doing really quite badly. Is this a bit of a last hurrah for the glossy magazine? Is it a generation like mine that's just used to, that still likes to actually hold and look at a magazine?
Can I just say Reveal is still here? Reveal's website has gone. Reveal magazine is still in existence.
Okay, thank you.
So we don't think that print will ever completely disappear. We think that it's really transitioning to a different, as you've said, it's kind of just a complementary service to the rest of a publisher's output. So people are still willing to pay for print in given circumstances. If you look at magazines like Delayed Gratification, which is a sort of kind of like very slow journalism, kind of lean back experience, people are willing to pay for that. It's what we do think it is the last hurrah for these print publications whose content can be easily replicated elsewhere. They're not serving the purpose. If you think about sort of why should anybody go and pay for a print magazine that just replicates stuff they've already read online? It doesn't make sense that way.
OK, well, Chris Sutcliffe is analyst at The Media Briefing and Farah Storer, editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan. Thank you both very much indeed.
So, as you can see, or hear rather, number of different arguments as to why magazines are in decline and the consequences of that, but also, quite interestingly, a good discussion of the possible future of magazines and the different aspects and technological advances that are going to maybe replace things like advertising in a traditional form, what magazines can do in terms of increasing long-form journalism to give readers that lean-back experience, and of course the main one being making sure that there is copy that isn't duplicated elsewhere or can't be found for free online. So have a look at the articles, have a think about some of the things that were said in that segment from the media show, and really it's something where you can draw your own conclusions and bring your own thoughts into a discussion, a debate about what will happen with the magazine industry in the future. Interesting to hear a bit about Vogue and the economic context in which that exists today. Of course, our interest in Vogue is with the 1965 edition that we've studied, and our modern media magazine text is The Big Issue, which we will look at in a lot more detail now. First of all, though, a few simple facts and reminders about how the magazine industry works. Primarily, they generate their revenue through two sources: sales of the copies, both print and digital, and of course through advertising. Advertising actually accounts for approximately 1/3 of total revenues across the whole industry, but of course that varies from magazine to magazine. And it is therefore vitally important that the magazine and its advertising content target the same audience in order that the advertising brands benefit from increased sales as a result of the advertising in the magazine. Andrew Green identifies the ways in which magazine advertising can benefit the advertisers in an article entitled Essentials, The Power of Magazine Advertising. And to summarise his arguments in bullet point form, he talks about high audience engagement, that there's less distraction likely from other activities, because if you're reading a magazine, you're committed to that magazine. You have an ability to target niche audiences in niche titles. You can up your production values and go for really glossy, lovely looking adverts. There's obviously potential for placement in highly relevant editorial environment, and these are considered to be non-intrusive. Whilst you do have to turn a page, that's all you have to do. And as was discussed in the media show radio clip, there seems to be an acceptance of advertising in magazines, maybe because we're just so familiar with it. Maybe pop-ups on websites are more annoying because they stop us from going where we want to go. And magazines, being linear in fashion, allow us to just keep flicking the pages. And the final benefit that Andrew Green identifies with print advertising and magazines is their longer shelf life. We should mention at this point also that digital magazine formats can offer these additional benefits the potential that they have for interactivity and very, very personalised targeting through algorithms. And of course, there are new high engagement formats. Okay, video is the obvious one, but as aforementioned, interactivity is a key element of some innovative advertising these days. If we turn our attention to the big issue though, and particularly our set text, we should really consider how the advertising of the big issue reflects the content and the target of the audience of the magazine. And also, how do the advertisers benefit from being in a magazine like the big issue? Well, of course, there are only a few adverts in this particular copy of the magazine, and that's pretty typical of the magazine as a whole, I would say. The 3 adverts, one for the Big Issue Foundation Knitathon, one for the country show in Wales, and the third advert being for the series Westworld, the HBO series premiering on Sky Atlantic, are a reflection perhaps of a more discerning, thoughtful audience. We've talked about the Explorer from the Four Seas as well as the Reformer as well. The Reformer would probably be interested in perhaps the charitable advertising through the Big Issue Foundation. The Explorer and the Reformer may be interested in a sort of community-based country fair show as advertised, as well as a brand new TV show that offers something a little bit different from your average science fiction show in Westworld. It may also reflect the age, family situation and interests of the big issue, and these are all things that we discussed when we were looking at audiences. Of course, the advertisers benefit from being in the big issue because of its trusted reputation. The target audience are fairly loyal to the big issue, as discussed when studying audiences. And of course, if the magazine is trusted, by proxy the products will be as well. So adding a kind of element of authenticity and believability to the claims the advertising makes. And in the case of the country fair, obviously raising the profile of something that wouldn't necessarily normally be able to afford or have the profile to advertise in a national weekly publication. But let's bring this round to a bit more about the economic and cultural contexts of magazines, and a graph at the top, or a chart I should say, that wouldn't surprise anyone in terms of the change in media consumption over what is only a 5-year period from 2015 to 2010, whereby of course internet has vastly increased in its usage, and then other media consumption has dramatically dropped, with newspapers being the absolute lowest and magazines not far behind. So the obvious answer for magazines to combat this is to take their products into that online environment. However, it really isn't that simple. Producing a digital edition of a magazine poses challenges for publishers, as the technology required to create a digital edition is obviously different to that required for print. So if the content's going to work on a digital platform, it requires often a large investment. As you can see, this does happen, but only to a very, very small extent at the moment. The pie chart there really emphasising just how much more popular print editions are to digital editions at the moment. But digital circulation of magazines is growing. However, it currently accounts for only a small percentage, as I said, of the overall magazine circulation. That's from the Press Gazette. Here's a quotation that might help us to understand this a little bit more. Digital magazines accounted for 2.5% of the total circulation audited by ABC in the second half of 2016. Digital editions, which is defined by ABC as digital versions which largely replicate the print edition, accounted for a further 1 million in circulation, which is actually up from 750,000 in the same period a year before. So let's continue looking at this argument of digital versus print, specifically with reference to the big issue. Now, the big issue is actually available to buy in a digital format from the online digital magazine store Zinio. Now, what we have to question is this a good thing or a bad thing? And if we want to know how we should think about this, we should probably consider what the aims of the magazine are all along. Of course, the simplest way of discussing this or describing the ideologies or the ethos or the aims of the big issue is that catchphrase they use, the strapline, a hand up, not a handout. The big issue is a UK-based street paper that supports the homeless, the vulnerably housed, those seeking to escape poverty. Vendors buy the magazine for £1.25 and sell to the public for £2.50. Now, of course, on the surface, that looks like it might be selling on Zinio will do the vendors out of some much-needed business. But these are the claims made on the Big Issues website. We're using Zinio digital editions to create additional revenue, opportunities to fund our street-based and pastoral care services for our vendors. We're a social enterprise company and all revenues go to support the vulnerable communities we serve. Our goal is to move our vendors away from dependency and towards full-time employment. So there are arguments for and against, really. The disadvantage would be that the real actual vendors, the people on the street who buy the magazine as a means of perhaps finding a place to stay, warming the houses, feeding themselves, does miss out somewhat. But the big issue reassures that all the money they make from the Zinio copies will go towards the good causes that they facilitate. So there are advantages to using the online publisher. It's a more popular format with some demographics. It might be easier for people these days, and especially those who maybe live in more rural areas and don't have a vendor close by to where they live. There's also, of course, the number crunching. Zinio has a global reach. It's available worldwide. And of course, whilst the big issue operates in about 7 different countries, that's far from all of them. There's a huge range of titles, some mainstream, some niche, some independent. So readers may be able to subscribe to one magazine and find out about others through Zinio. Zinio currently has 10 million readers, which utterly maximises the audience reach for a magazine like The Big Issue. And of course there's the availability to download onto almost any digital service, which maximises the potential audience reach for Zinio, offers a single use or a subscription, allows readers the chance to read one copy and then subscribe to more if they want to. So it really is a format that knows its audience and knows how to work with audiences. So what is the Big Issue's online presence? Well, it's really as you would expect. Aside from having its own website, it has its own social media presence. The YouTube page, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, all included as part of its online package, if you like. So there are certain questions that you should probably try and answer and have a look at and do a bit of research to really get a sense of the user's experience of the Big Issue online. So questions like, how does the website reinforce the brand identity in a magazine? Is there a clear house style that is evident across the magazine and the website, and by extension its social media platforms? What does the website offer that's maybe different from the content of the magazine? What gives it a uniqueness? How does the website extend the brand? Maybe through videos, maybe through merchandising? How does the magazine use social media and that is utilise it? In what way does it make use of it to either encourage people to read more or encourage others to read who may not already be audience members? And what levels of interactivity are there between the website, the social media, and the audience themselves? So just as a answer to some of those questions that we've asked, there is obviously an appeal to audiences who can access a much wider range of associated additional content. Maybe they're videos, maybe they're just simply online articles. The online versions of magazines offer numerous opportunities for audiences to be more interactive, to become more loyal to the brand, to take ownership of the brand itself, and that would include an encouragement to follow on social media. Of course, when you're following online, you're going to get much more regular updates, which mean that readers don't have to wait for the next publication. Publishers can reinforce its brand values by, for example, offering additional features on specific topics. Publishers then can offer more prominence to more specific advertisers, preferably those who are giving more money. And of course, the brand can be further reinforced by the cross-platform content that can emerge on a number of different sites. So very much in line with what was discussed in the Future of Magazine articles and the conversation had on the BBC Media Show. In terms of its ownership, the Big Issue is, as we know, a street newspaper founded by Bird and Roddick in 1991. But in 1995, the Big Issue Foundation was set up to offer additional support, and this is really the charitable wing of the Big Issue, if the rest of it is a social enterprise. And that's who has owned and run the Big Issue for many years. At this point, it might be interesting for us to consider some of the theory side of things. In particular, the summary of the book by James Curran and Gene Seaton, Power Without Responsibility, which tackles and puts under the microscope the power structures and systems in play in the major media industries. So just to kind of remind you and summarise the ideas of Curran and Seaton, they really talk about the idea that the media is controlled by a small number of companies that are primarily driven by a logic of profit and power. They discuss how the media concentration generally limits or inhibits variety and creativity and quality. Finally, that they believe that if there were more socially diverse patterns of ownership, that this would help to create the conditions for more varied and adventurous media productions. Now, with what we know about the Big Issue and its independent roots and ownership, it should be fairly simple to apply this theory to the Big Issue. Of course, it's not for profit, it's an independent magazine, and its aims are really to bring about social change and eradicate poverty. As we know, it has a unique distribution whereby vendors, who are people who have issues with homelessness, are the ones who sell it to the public. This is what the editor, Paul McNamee, has said about it. We focused on stories and voices that really tell an outsider story. Important voices that are rarely properly heard in the mainstream media. Hitting 25th anniversary lead me again to look at what the Big Issue was at launch. So we've gone back to early approaches of a certain stridency, a more agitating voice. So as always a fairly a magazine which very much wears its ideologies on its sleeve. Of course, there are plenty of examples throughout the Big Issue that support the view that its ownership has, of course, allowed for more varied and adventurous content. There are many articles in the Big Issue that you really wouldn't see in other publications, which takes us on to some of the ownership of the bigger companies and more, shall we say, mainstream magazines. Hearst Magazines and Time Inc., which used to be IPC, as you can see, have a vast array of different publications, many of which will seem very familiar to you. You'll have seen them on the shelves of WH Smith and various supermarkets as well. And as you can see, they're all fairly similar to each other. They all fit into quite conventional genres, and many of the titles might actually seem to be quite similar. And if you look at the ownership of these titles from these big horizontally integrated conglomerates, it does appear that Curran and Seaton have a point about the fact that with big corporations comes homogeneous content. As I said, these titles are all very similar, and many of them are actually fading away. It also, in that respect, does reveal why so many of these generic publications are ceasing to print, if that information can be found not only in other titles but duplicated online. And whilst it's certainly true that a lot of publications are struggling, and as we've said, folding or going online entirely for all the reasons that we've explored earlier, there are actually some that are thriving. And actually these tend to be those that exist within the indie sector. The reasons for this are actually outlined in articles by Dominic Ponsford and in an interview in Huck magazine with Ruth Jameson. What's also interesting is that it does seem that some of these big multinational or horizontally integrated publishing companies seem to be paying attention to the rise of the indie magazine and paying attention by getting involved with them. The Big Issue actually now has an association with publishing giants Dennis, and that's resulted in a move that's both benefited the magazine and the company itself. So let's move on to regulation. And just like newspapers, the magazine industry used to be regulated by the Press Complaints Commission, which, as we know, was deemed unfit for purpose after the phone hacking scandal surrounding a number of tabloid newspapers a few years ago. It's been replaced by a regulator called IPSO, which has its own code of practice covering a number of different areas that publishers must abide by, and that can be found on their website, so you should probably go and have a look at that and just make yourself aware of the different areas that publishers and editors need to abide by. In terms of what it means for us, and in particular Vogue magazine, the theorists that we look at here are Livingston and Lunt and their ideas of regulation. In a nutshell, they have two parts to their argument. First of all, that there is an underlying struggle in recent UK regulation policy between the need to further the interests of citizens by offering them protection from harmful or offensive material, and the need to further the interests of consumers by ensuring choice, value for money and market competition. Second of all, as they move their arguments on, they talk about the fact that there is an increasing power of global media corporations, together with the rise of convergent media technologies and transformations in the production, distribution and marketing of digital media, and what this has done is placed traditional approaches to media regulation at risk. Well, relating this to Big Issue, arguably, the need for more salacious content and competition from online news sources was perhaps one of the reasons, or the catalyst at least, for the actions of the tabloid press that led to the phone hacking scandal in the first place. Interestingly, the tabloid press used the excuse that their stories were always in the public interest as a reason for their actions, although I suppose we can see that neither of those reasons were really an excuse for some of the things that were done. Now, the Big Issue magazine is a magazine which doesn't hide from representing some of the most controversial issues. It's proud of its ability to challenge the establishment and to challenge dominant ideologies in society. However, it does also pride itself on standing up for the little guy in society. Now, seeing as IPSO was set up to protect the vulnerable and the marginalised in society, it would be unlikely that the Big Issue would do anything that would contravene their rules.